talk about their work because they know more about it than I do. So, all right.
Thank you.
All right, so my name's Chloe Allred, and this is yes. Okay, we are the Body Joy Project, and we are a feminist artist collective. And we started this project as a way to rethink the way our culture thinks about the body, and to create positive images and tell the stories of all different kinds of people. So different body types, different races, different genders, different sexual orientations, etc. And we passionately believe that there's not one way of being a person. That's kind of what we create our art about. That there are all these differences between us, but that these should be points of celebration, not of judgment. 1 second, turning the page. In my work with the Body Joy Project, I've done a lot of work with survivors of eating disorders and also survivors of sexual violence. And that's really what I've kind of focused on with the Body Joy Project. And in the past 2 years in particular, I've really focused on creating paintings and doing activism around preventing campus sexual violence, and have done a lot of stories and interviews with survivors of that violence. And the more I've gotten into this issue of campus sexual assault, the more I've been really frustrated by a real lack of accountability when it comes to this issue. So when I say that, I mean a lack of accountability for schools and institutions that are dealing with survivors that often try to suppress and silence them and instead are supporting perpetrators. A lack of accountability with the justice system, also which often works in silencing survivors. And this is something I know both through research, but also primarily through interviewing and working with so many survivors of assault. And mostly a lack of accountability when it comes to perpetrators of this kind of violence. We're often just kind of given a pass by higher education institutions, by the justice system, and also in the media. So oftentimes other aspects of their personality, like how great they are at athletics, is emphasized over the kind of crimes that they've committed, right? So what this led to for me was creating, in the past year, these perpetrator portraits. So I've also been doing portraits of survivors, which is about honoring them and their experiences. And the perpetrator portraits are about accountability. And it's about showing what the sort of hidden nature of sexual violence, and also showing kind of what it takes to be able to dehumanize somebody in this way. And it's also, for me, a way to have a bit of control. So in the frame of this canvas, I can hold perpetrators accountable, right? Through paint and texture and showing what they're actually like, rather than showing a rosy view of them. And so I did a lot of these portraits. I did about 10. And they were both perpetrators from my personal life and then also perpetrators from the media, right? And the news cycle. You might recognize this one. So following the 2016 election, I had to make a shift because I found myself as an artist, as a survivor of rape, and as an activist who is dedicated to preventing sexual violence and was hearing all these stories. I found myself just incredibly overwhelmed. And now facing a president with sexual assault allegations in the double digits, and to routinely describe women in really repugnant ways. And I just had a hard time coming to my studio, because my studio was now full of these like textured perpetrator portraits, and it just felt all too big to handle, right? So I had to ask myself, what is the way forward in this world now, right? So for my own well-being, I had to make this shift. And at the same time, and still now, there's this rise in hate crimes. So I was reading these articles about Jewish cemeteries being desecrated and mosques being vandalized and people of color being assaulted. And it just made me think, what would the opposite of a hate crime look like, right? How could I make that happen? And so it also just made me think, okay, when a hate crime is committed, that can change how someone navigates the world, right? And how you look at a crowd of strangers. Because you don't know if one of those strangers could have done this horrible thing to you and could hate you just for something like your race or your religion or your sexual orientation, right? But so what I started to think about is, well, what if instead you found a love note left at your church, say, a love note from a stranger? That could also change how you navigate the world, right? That could change how you then see a crowd of strangers. Knowing that even within this crowd, there could be somebody who celebrates your humanity just because you're you and doesn't see those differences as something that's bad. So out of that, I made another project, and kind of under the Body Joy Project umbrella, and it's called Resist with Love Notes. And so what I did, starting in on Valentine's Day of this year, as I made a lot of love notes, like so, these huge valentines, right? And in the love notes, sometimes it would just say something like love and would be really decorative. Other times it would be celebrating artists that I love. They're often also people of color, like Maya Angelou or Frida Kahlo. And I take these love notes and I dedicate them to different groups of people. So, and specifically groups of people that in today's climate, I feel worried about. So like refugees, immigrants, survivors of domestic violence or assault, right? And so then I put a lot of time and love into these pieces, and I would take them and go and leave them in different places. So at community centers or bus stops or rape crisis centers. And the idea is to basically do this act of love and then leave it there for a stranger to discover and to potentially change how they see the world, right? Or to at least give them a moment of wonder. And so that's what I've been doing. And what's also been amazing is, you know, sometimes I really don't know what happens to them. They could have just been thrown away. But oftentimes people do find them and they reach out, because along with the love note, I leave a note linking back to our website and to an address for the project. And so people can connect back with us and let us know how it's changed their day. And for me, even if it's just one positive action that makes someone's day, that's enough. And so that's kind of what I've been dedicating my time towards now. So at this point, I think we can also transition to Gabby and the work that she's been doing that's in a similar vein.
Yeah, I thought that was a good idea too. So I moved to LA to, is it as echoey? It's more echoey.
That's better.
So I moved to LA 2 years ago to start a master's in yoga studies. And having lived in Washington State most of my life, and then moving to Los Angeles, which is one of the most diverse cities in this country, the city became like a mirror to my own nature. I started recognizing intrinsic biases in myself, which is never easy, but always useful, because it brought me to this aha moment. So I realized that I had, for most of my life, I have been starved of exposure to different types of people. While I've traveled a lot of the world, I've never stayed long enough in one place to allow that city to challenge my faults. I'd like to believe that I'm a good person, but believing that also means believing that I have things I need to work on. Living in LA and practicing yoga for most of my life has taught me that there is always room to grow, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that fact. Election night 2016 fell into the time period leading up to my thesis semester, where I was deciding what I was going to focus my efforts on. And the results of that night left me feeling depressed. I felt a loss of hope, and I felt desperate for action and to find a community. So after creating a Sound of Music inspired graphic with Maria's arms wide open, holding the phrase, "The more hate and havoc that you wreak, the more love I'll speak," I joined a NonViolence workshop. We met weekly, Sunday mornings, to speak about and hold each other accountable for nonviolent principles like love and kindness and compassion through thought, action, and speech. So it's here that I learned about another nonviolence workshop that had been held for the last 15 years by Reverend Lawson, who is one of the last living people to have worked directly with Martin Luther King Jr. I can't express enough how moving this experience was. Once a month for 4 hours, I sat in a group of 40 or more people from all different backgrounds. While it's not entirely true, it felt like the entire world was represented in this space. So here we sat, united with the intention to listen to the Reverend talk about nonviolent activism, and also to listen to each other's opinions and hurts and experiences of life. This experience began to slowly peel away and remove those biases that I had noticed in myself earlier.
Can you please?
I had witnessed the power firsthand, the power of exposure, and a willingness to admit wrong and commit to becoming something better. A combination of this experience, along with my worries about the increasing hate crimes and news about the refugee crisis, led me to my thesis topic, healing the individual, healing the community, an application of nonviolent activism with yoga and mindfulness practices for male refugees. So initially propelled by my passion for women's rights, I wanted to create a program for women. But the more that I was researching, I started to notice a humanitarian gap for and aid efforts for male refugees. So there is a disproportionate amount of attention given to women and children in these particular humanitarian aid efforts, disregarding the needs of men. And this is, of course, not an argument to say that efforts and aid for women and children should be lessened. Of course not. What I'm asking for, realizing, is that there needs to be an equal amount of aid for both genders. And this actually, in turn, not only betters the experience for men, but in turn also the women. So in my opinion, and through this research, I believe this imbalance is from a combination of reasons. So in the history of refugee aid, men were given preference. And to make up for that, we've basically swung in the opposite direction. When it comes to representation of young male refugees, and sometimes people who look like them, they often get grouped in media representation, and they're also often the antagonists of the most horrific news that's presented to us. And this creates fear and public opinion that these men are potential threats, that they can't be trusted, and let alone looked after. Since we're not generally exposed to these men on a regular basis, it's very difficult to try to combat this opinion that's being created by the media. And this, in the end, serves no one. And the third point is that sexism is seen in the biased belief that women are vulnerable and need help, whereas the men are strong and self-sufficient and don't need any care. The most eye-opening aspect of what I learned through my research came from the results of a survey done by the International Rescue Committee with young Syrian men. For time purposes, I won't give you all the results from this, but what I can conclude from this is that these men live in a constant state of fear and anxiety, and they rarely or never have been able to express their traumatic experience that they've gone through and continue to go through. And what we know from trauma research is that living in a lack of safety and a constant state of fear creates a lack of sense of self, and it also increases hormones in the body, and this can be seen as violent outbursts, anger, and severe depression. The multi-layered process of healing from trauma includes verbalization, positive community relationships, movement, and inner reflection. These avenues, as of now, are not available to these men. And this affects the overall safety for women and children in the camps, and it even goes into resettlement. Essentially what happens when trauma is neglected is that it starts to fall into a circular pattern of behavior that, unless given tools and attention, is incredibly difficult to get out of. Some of these men have committed terrible acts of violence, physical and sexual, which I absolutely do not condone. But one of the reasons that I moved my focus to men for my thesis is that I believe that anger and violence are learned behaviors, and they have a root cause that is most likely related to social conditioning and past trauma. If that trauma is never addressed or worked through, then it definitely can come out in vicious ways. I recognize that this is a level of compassion that is difficult, and it takes a lot of work. It doesn't just happen. I admit that it's a personal choice, and it begins as an intellectual process, much like those intrinsic biases that I noticed in myself. It needs to be recognized with the mind first, and then you can start to build a practice that can instill change for yourself. Practicing nonviolence is one way to start to begin this change. So violence seeks to dominate and to separate us. All it does is change the structure of two different people or forces. Nonviolence seeks to unite, and it's a relational transformation, which is what makes it sustainable. It begins as an internal practice before it can be practiced externally. And most would say that I'm not really a violent person. What are you talking about? I'm already practicing nonviolence. But this is the sneakiness of violence. It lives subtly in our lives, especially here in the West. It's negative self-talk. It's that us versus them mentality. It's victim blaming. It's ignoring those in need. A nonviolence practice starts off as simple as allowing that giant spider in your home to live. Perhaps move it outside where you both can feel happy. And that may seem sort of silly or insignificant, but it is actually these really small actions that can lead to a much larger action. The program that I've created is a 10-week trauma-sensitive workshop for male refugees. We practice yoga and concepts of nonviolence, guided by the 8 limbs of Patanjali. And we practice skills that are often lost in trauma. So this includes the ability to express experience and emotion, the ability to be in the present moment, to be mindful, and to have curiosity. The goal is to move away from being reactive to being reflective in both body and mind, and then eventually in action. So while this began as a way for myself to heal and to start to work away those intrinsic biases, it has become much bigger than that, much more than just me. And as part of my commitment to a yogic practice and yogic principles like nonviolence, I have made the commitment to stay open to the other, as difficult as that can be sometimes, and also to live as best I can the concept that we're truly not that different. And we're all searching to feel accepted, to feel safe, loved, and happy. Thank you.
So again, we are the Body Joy Project. We have flyers that you can get over there and in our booth, and you can make a love note in our booth until 6. And you can check out more about our project at thebodyjoyproject.com. where we update about shows, and we're going to have a shop coming soon. So check it out.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing and the healing that you are creating for a group for people that get pushed aside quite often or victimized or just we don't want to deal with you, and so thank you. Thank you. All right, so we're